welcome to a scrawling new episode of the StudioMEcast. I'm your host, Peter, joining you from StudioME's Speakeasy in East Liberty, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And if you like the look and sound of this podcast, well, you can book it yourself at StudioME.me. But we also have other spaces, including, and those of you who have been watching the show already know this, but you'll hear it again, we have opened our first satellite location, The Meetup, powered by StudioME in Oakland. So if you're the kind of person who's just listening to the podcast, we're happy you're here, but if you just take a quick look at your screen, you'll see that we have some B-roll. Oh, isn't that a lovely space? Can't you imagine yourself there? Wonderful. So if you're looking to start a podcast or continue one, which you've already begun, we'd love to have you. So check that out at StudioME.me. Also, if you're the kind of person who subscribes, do that, whatever, etc. Wonderful. But let's get on with it because, as always, we have a special guest. Today, I'm joined by Kris Chandler, who is a writer, and we met recently because we have a mutual connection, Curtis Caldwell, who's been on the show before. I'm sure he'll be back again sometime. Curtis, hope you're doing great. And but we'll just get right into it. Kris, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. So when we were talking before, I was really happy to hear about that you got started in writing as a poet, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that's correct.
Fantastic. Let's start there with poetry. What kind of poetry, or can you give us a sense of the type of work that you've done for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, Edgar Allan Poe was a huge inspiration. I was that dark, moody kid that just wanted to write and stare out the window and, look at the rain and, the clouds and whatnot. But yeah, that was really my first deep dive into writing, into creativity. Growing up, I was also a big fan of fantasy and sci-fi movies. So I think there's a blend of, Victorian drama mixed with fantasy, mixed with magical realism. Huge fan of Pan's Labyrinth, for example. That's a huge inspiration of mine. So yeah, I started with poetry, probably around 5th or 6th grade.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I had a teacher.
Edgar Allan Poe at 5th and 6th grade?
Yeah, it was a lot of themes.
Fantastic.
For 6th grader.
Wow.
A lot of heavy themes.
Do you have a favorite work by Edgar Allan Poe?
The Raven.
Raven.
I mean, it's a classic.
Nevermore.
Exactly,
Excellent.
Nevermore. I want to get a Nevermore tattoo.
Oh,
these
yeah.
days.
Would you get a raven with it?
Oh, absolutely.
Do you have any tattoos?
I do. I have one on my left arm.
Yeah. Can you explain it for us?
Yeah, no, so I got the numbers 13, 14, and 15 written in Roman numerals to represent the Reconstruction Amendments of the Constitution.
Very cool.
For a while there, I wanted to be a lawyer. Still low-key kind of do a little bit. And those amendments, as Black American, really speak and resonate with me. So
absolutely. Well, that's fascinating to me that you also have an interest in the law.
Yeah.
And so, have you done? Have you ever taken classes? Have you studied law?
I have a little bit. Yeah. So, so I did my undergrad at Point Park University here in Pittsburgh, in screenwriting, which we'll get to later. But my minor was political science, and before going to Point Park, I was actually doing international affairs at another school. So, international affairs, poli-sci, law was all a part of what I wanted to do. And that's actually kind of what I do a little bit in my day job now. I actually work in transportation policy. So totally different from film and writing. But, that interest in law and political science is still there. So
absolutely.
I still dabble.
Wow, that's fantastic. Yeah. So that's really fascinating to me. Has there been a connection? Do you view studying law as completely separate from your writing, or have they come together before?
They've been able to merge a lot, not just with law, but also with political science and transportation policy. One thing that I've really honed in on as I've been trying to decide what I wanted to do with my life and with my career, and now being back in Pittsburgh, it's what I kind of figured out is that I wanted to blend public policy with creative writing, and what does that look like?
Yeah.
And for me, what I've discovered, especially in transportation policy, is how to tell data-driven stories. So how to talk about how a policy decision, whether it be a local one, a state one, a federal one, whatever the case may be, how those policy decisions affect people on the ground. in telling those stories back out to the community and back out to the public officials making those decisions. So I was fortunate enough in my current job and in my job prior, I worked at 2 awesome nonprofits. And while working for them, I was able to hone in on that craft of like how to take very detailed and nuanced and annoying and sometimes very stupid policy decisions and translate that to how they will actually impact people in the community.
That's fantastic because so much of that stuff can be so hard for people to understand. And one of the best ways to get someone to remember something and understand something, I believe, is to put it in a story. If I just wax eloquent about some particular technical topic for 45 minutes and then test people on it, there may be varying degrees of success. But if I show someone a 3.5-hour cut of Lord of the Rings or something like that, at the end of it, if I ask them what was that about, they'll be able to tell me that story, at least in most cases, And so it's one of those things that is really cool that you've picked up on with your own experience and the strength that you can push toward, as well as it being like this bridging of your interests as well. So, well, let's continue on. So, poetry, inspirations from Edgar Allan Poe, like all the other things that you mentioned. But then you got into playwriting as well, which sounds pretty natural to me. A lot of Edgar Allan, not all poetry has necessarily a narrative element, right?
Yeah.
But Poe does. He'll tell a story, with a trochee, and so there's, but how did what was it like writing your first play? How did that happen? Like what prompted that anyway?
It's funny because one thing I didn't mention in between the poetry and the playwriting was writing lyrics and like writing music.
Oh, okay.
Inspiration for that real quick was actually super silly, but so the TV show Drake and Josh.
Yes.
Drake on the show was, if you're familiar with the show, he was a musician. And of course, being like a young impressionable kid at the time, I was like, oh, like it'd be cool to be like him and be a songwriter and be a singer. And that's literally how I got into writing lyrics, was watching Drake and Josh.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Super silly. But it was really like between reading poetry and writing poetry and watching TV shows like that as a young kid, I just kind of got this spark to make my own content. So it was a really quick transition from poetry into writing lyrics into writing short stories. And then I was really big into acting. So I did like little performances at school. And then in high school, I really blossomed, quote unquote, as an actor.
Were you in like the high school musicals and
I was in all the high school musicals. I was in Anything Goes. I played Seaweed in Hairspray, which was like
nice,
the best of it. I played Friar Lawrence and Romeo and Juliet.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah,
wow.
So all these different
Shakespeare.
things. Yes, classic Shakespeare. Gotta love it. So all these different things all over the place. And while I was doing that, I was like, I also want to create my own stories and write for theater, because apart from film, I think theater has this very, very personal aspect to it, because you're performing right there in the space with the people absorbing your performance, and there was something really intimate about that I loved. I loved getting that initial feedback from the audience, whether it was fear or drama or comedy or whatever, and I really wanted to be able to invoke that in people. So I just kind of one day just started writing my own little short plays and one acts, and they're not great. I still have them at my house, but they were really, I think, the real start of me becoming a writer.
That's fantastic. So let's get into part of the sort of process for this. When you were starting to write these, were you typing them up? Did you have a notepad? If you were typing them, where were you typing them on? Was it a laptop? Was it a school computer? Like what did it look like from an outsider while you were starting to do this?
Early on, it was all by hand, all on notebooks. honestly, I think I have wrist problems today because of it. But yeah, it was all notebooks of varying sizes and degrees. I again still have them all at home, like all of my old transcripts. And it was just me at my dining room table, just writing by hand. And like I had this little green um kind of like carry around notebook that I always had in my pocket. And anytime I had like an initial idea, I would just like scribble it down real quick.
Pen or pencil or marker?
Early on, pencil.
Mm-hmm.
Towards high school, pen, just because I loved, I don't know, writing with pens.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, as every writer has probably been through this phase, but I always wanted like a fountain pen.
Yeah.
You know, like you gotta have one at some point in your life.
Fun.
It's so fun. It's so fun. You gotta do it. So I used one of those at one point. But yeah, so I always had little notebooks around, and I still have them today.
Fantastic. Yeah, I still have I used to be a spiral bound notebook guy.
Okay. Yeah.
And I've got like shelves of these things. Never threw any of them away. I have the first one, yeah. And I've like moved on to like nowadays I'll typically write first in sketchbooks because I'll also draw while I write. I try to like make sure that I do that.
Yeah.
Because I knew for a long time everything was the written word for me. But then as time has gone by and I'm like, oh, I need to be thinking more visually. What happens if I draw more of this out? So it depends on the project and what's happening. Like sometimes, rarely, I'll type something first, like, but that's almost never, you know? So, but that's really great. That's super cool that you kept all that stuff. We have interns here at the studio, one of whom, Chloe, is running today's podcast. But I was talking with one of our other interns today about don't throw anything away from your creative endeavors. Like 100%. We were talking about backing up files on hard drives and stuff like that, because this past weekend I found a file from 2019 that I really needed on Sunday. But fantastic. So you got more into playwriting through this really cool journey that we're going down. What kind of did you experiment with a lot of different genres? Were you focused more on character? How did that start off with when you started playwriting, and then kind of where have you gotten to more lately as a result?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, for me, character-driven stories are something that I really wanted to focus on. I think that came from being an actor, and being a performer. I really honed in on like, what does it mean to tap into a character, to tap into a life of a character. Something I do now in my practice is I will try to think of the life of a character or like a protagonist before the events of the movie or short film that I'm writing, just to kind of really get deep into who that person is and who that individual wants to be as the progression of the story is being fleshed out.
Real quick, when you're doing that, have you ever kind of changed what you were doing while writing? Like maybe you have an idea for a story and a character, and then while you're coming up with the backstory, you figure out, oh, there's a more interesting story here, and then you write that instead. Has that ever happened with you?
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes, yeah. 100%, and it's super annoying because I'm like, oh, damn.
Like, I want to make this movie, and then you come up with a better one. It's like, I guess that's great.
I guess that's what I'll do. And that's what I'll try to do, though, is like, if something new does come up as I'm writing something else, I'll try to figure out if I can configure that to a totally different, like, concept or idea.
I see.
You know, if I can turn that into something else. Because I think for me, it's very hard for me to come up with like original ideas off the jump, you know? So if I can have an idea be born from something I'm already working on, that's the ideal situation.
You use the word original there. What, I guess, how important is it for you that something come off as original, I guess? And here's what I mean by that question. So for instance, sometimes writers work in genres, right? Sometimes on purpose is what I mean, sometimes by accident. But, you know, in order to be a part of a genre, you have to have the things that are present in there, which might make it not feel original, but you're trying to make it fresh or whatever. it's really easy to get inspired by another film and think, oh, I want to make something like that, and then but still want to make something original. Uh, and this is an idea I've chewed on for years and years, but how present is the thought of originality in your mind while you're writing?
It is very, very present. I like too present. And I think honestly it's sometimes the thing that gets in the way. Because I don't like writing or even watching things that are unoriginal. Like I hate seeing the same stories over and over again. And especially in the genres that I write, to answer your prior question,
Yes.
I do a lot of dramatic work, and I think the theater kind of comes in play there. So I write a lot about relationships. I write a lot about like internal struggle, mental health struggle, and then in blending those genres with sci-fi or fantasy or psychological thriller, or like crime. But at the end of the day, it's really relationships. I think that's where I kind of fall into the most. With that though, I hate writing relationships that we see all the time on TV and in film, which is like the straightforward, like, husband and wife or like man and woman. They're arguing because the man's being stupid and the wife wants to do something else, and they go off and split away. I hate when it's that quote unquote straightforward. And obviously those situations happen in real life, obviously, but I think there's a nuance there that can be tapped into. So like, for example, speaking of Curtis, I'm working on a project with him right now, called Corner. And the crux of it, without giving too much away, is that it's a story about a couple that works together at a restaurant in a small town. And the man wants to stay in the small town, and he has a very happy existence doing what he's doing currently. And the woman in the relationship wants to leave and kind of see what else life has to offer. That's the short of it. Very straightforward, very common. Even though it's a common story on the surface, it is important for me as a writer to dive deeper into the nuance of their relationship. So, I'm working with Curtis on it. I'm also working with my wife, Stacia Pagliari. Shout out to her. She's also a local actor here in Pittsburgh. So Stacia and I, we sat down with Curtis a few weeks ago, and I just asked him a bunch of questions about just the relationship of the two protagonists. Like, how long have they been together? How do you imagine they got together back in the day? Do they live together? Do they not? Like, just every detail of their relationship that I could think of in the moment, I wanted to get his insight on, because I wanted to thread the narrative with all those different elements so that it is a very unique story about the relationship of just these two individuals, and something that's totally different than another couple somewhere else. So originality is huge for me in writing anything.
Right. I agree sometimes what you said also, that sometimes it can get in the way. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, because if you can't think of anything original, then you're not writing.
Right. Yeah.
And that's something that I think is a struggle. Going back to Corner, that's just another thing that's a struggle for me, because, I'm drafting some notes for it right now, and I think I have the beginning pretty fleshed out. I have the end pretty fleshed out of how I want to see it. But the middle section is a blur in my brain, and I have different notes and different directions I can go with it. But because I'm only thinking of things I've seen in other TV shows or other movies, it's preventing me from writing this part of the process, doing this kind of pre-writing process.
Right.
So yeah, it's very crippling. It's very discouraging, because then you kind of get in your head about how talented you are as a creative. And if you're just like biting off of other people, or if you are your own like original writer. So yeah, it can be very crippling. But I think in moments like that, I try to step back from the project a little bit. Ironically, I will try to like watch or read other stuff, because sometimes I can get an original idea from watching or reading other stuff.
sometimes as a reaction to seeing a trope that you're sick of.
Correct.
I'd imagine.
Exactly.
As well.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like sometimes I think Alan Moore mentioned about writing. He said, read, but he said you should read great books and classics. He said, but also read bad books.
Yes, 100%.
It's like few things can be more inspiring to a writer than a bad book. And I was like, that's pretty true.
100%. There's so many times where I like read or watch something, and also just for like the encouragement, like if it's bad, and be like, wow, they were able to like get this created.
It even got made.
It got made, so this can get made.
That stuff gets made all the time.
Exactly. So it's very encouraging in that regard. But yeah.
Well, that's cool to get those insights on inspirations too. And it sounds like you've carried your love of poetry and lyrics and these other mediums that aren't necessarily explicitly dependent on film being part of their creation. So getting inspiration outside of the medium of screenwriting, which is something that I always love hearing about. It's like, I love movies, I love watching them, but I also like to explore things outside of cinema to help with my inspiration as well, particularly with writing. So that's good. So you may have said before, but this film that you've been outlining for us that you're doing with Curtis Caldwell, is this a short or a feature? Do you have any concept of what it would? Is that even formed yet?
Yeah, it's gonna be a short. That's what we're kind of angling towards. Curtis, Curtis is a great collaborator. I met him through my wife Stacia. They did a project together recently. But yeah, he's a great collaborator. So he was very open about kind of letting me decide whether or not I wanted to take it as a short or take it as a feature. I think where it's at right now in the process, it's going to be a short. It's going to be a little bit longer, though, maybe on like the 20-25 minute side. Okay. That's when I kind of lingering towards. And it's going to be a very visual project. And by that, I mean, so backtrack a little bit. As a writer, one thing I do in film a lot is I'll write a lot of unfilmables. So like descriptors or thoughts of characters that aren't necessarily going to be the focus of a shot or even the story, but I'll put it in the script anyway. Yeah. So for this project, I really want to...
And could you give us an example of that?
Yeah, so, actually I was listening to another podcast actually, and they were talking about the movie Challengers, for example. In the script of Challengers, I don't know if you've read it yet or not, but in the script at the start, it describes the tennis match that the characters are having. So not only just like, character A and character B are standing there, one's throwing the ball and hitting it towards the other, they describe the entirety of the set and of the advertisement on the side of the tennis court. Like they get into the detail of the space and then dive deeper and go into the detail of the thought of the characters in the moment and like what that translates to, or how that translates to the narrative that's about to be rolled out. So those are things that like when you're in film school, they're like, don't write that stuff. So those are the choices of the director and, the production designer, blah, blah, blah. But for me, I want the script to be a piece of art in and of itself. So I think it's important to write a lot of those details in the script because I think it makes it a fuller piece. So going back to Corner, I plan to write a lot of the visuals that the audience will see in the movie, despite whether or not those visuals are directly correlated to the narrative. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I sometimes like to put stuff in there that like might help the actors get something across. Yes. Like there was a thing I was helping to write recently. I was just one of the collaborators on it, but it had a moment where I was tasked with writing a character death. I wouldn't say what, because spoilers are evil. But it was I just wrote in the script like as this person's dying, it's like a bad guy, I just said like I think the line was, they know they're going to hell or something like that. Like, just part of it's just like, as this person's losing this fight, they start to realize they're losing it. And, it just changes the dynamic of what's going on. It's not just, it's like, oh,
Exactly.
just losing it. So,
yeah.
But I like that kind of thing, because if it helps, especially with stuff like that, but also what you said about the screenplay. Sometimes it's such a strange art form, because it can be seen as just a means to an end, because the point is to get it made, right? It's like, it's not. I mean, when this thing's done, then it's okay, well, what are we going to do with it?
Exactly.
And then even at that point, it might change a lot, on the cutting room. But I like that you approach it, and I imagine that being a poet has a lot to do with this mindset, but approaching it as its own work that needs to, I think when we had mentioned this before when we first met, and I think I said something like that, just shows a level of care for what you're writing that I think, does add something to it. It might be intangible, but it's like when you're watching a film, you can usually tell if there's passion behind this thing or not.
Absolutely.
It's hard to quantify, but there's a difference. Yeah. And it's part of how I think what makes sometimes even a bad film, in the colloquial sense, a bad film fun to watch, is if there's passion behind it. Yeah. But anyway, so you're working on this script with Curtis Caldwell, but something that you wrote recently is The Courier.
Yes.
For the 48-Hour Film Project. The Pittsburgh 48-Hour Film Project, of course, as you all know, StudioME is a proud sponsor of the 48, and congratulations to the teams that had their encore screening recently. It was a wonderful, fun night. PJ is a great host, as always. Everybody knows I wouldn't trust anybody who said otherwise, so that's a wonderful event. And the film that you wrote, The Courier, was part of the encore screening. Yes, it was. And we'd like to talk about that. But just to recap for people, do this real quick. The 48-Hour Film Project, a bunch of teams assemble, and they are given 48 hours to complete a short film. All the teams are given a bunch of the same requirements. They have to have a certain line of dialogue. This year, the line of dialogue was, "Thank you for being my friend." They had to have the same character, who had to be an unemployed Ted or Tina Gold. And they all had to use a prop. In this case, it was a compact mirror, so all the films had a compact mirror somewhere. Sometimes it was short and quick. If you blink, you miss it, but sometimes it was an integral part of the film. Sometimes it was unexplained. Sometimes it was a joke. Sometimes it was, I think someone probably used it as a weapon at some point. They usually do. But then each of the teams is given 2 different genres, of which they're able to use one or both of. And that's what separates the teams from each other, is the genres that are essentially picked out of a hat, sometimes literally and sometimes through, rolling the dice online. So that's what's going on with the 48. Back to the show, everybody. So for the encore screening, the best of, awards night, all that, your film made it through to that. I was there for the show, but were you able to attend?
Yes, I was there.
Great, fantastic. Yes, so for that film, tell me a bit about the process of writing The Courier, which, by the way, it might not be, when we first post this episode, might not be in the description, but when that film is available, we'll make sure to link that in the description below, so you can take a look at what we're talking about. So that's your spoiler alert warning and all that. So we're going to talk about this film as in depth as we feel like. So thank you very much. All right, so The Courier.
Yes.
First, what were the genres that you pulled?
Yeah, so we initially pulled film to film, which for the people that don't know, film to film is a woman-led story with a woman-led, protagonist, as much as humanly possible. So we get that, and then we get musical as well. Really wanted to do musical because I love musicals, but that is a terror to do in 48 hours. So we decided to do film to film.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
All right, so film to film. Now, there were some me see here. A few familiar faces to me. Film, including Isaac Miller.
Yes.
We was very pleased and happy to see in the film. I'm like, oh, it's Isaac. Oh, I didn't know you were in that. Oh, wonderful. So you went with Film de Femme.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes on teams there's a bunch of writers and then there's a head writer who types it up. What was the process for writing this film?
Yeah, for sure. So to backtrack a little bit, so we, knew early on, and by we I mean myself and my wife Stacia, we knew early on about the 48 coming up. And Stacia has always wanted to, she's an actor, but she's always wanted to like direct and just be more involved in filmmaking, especially now as her career is really ramping up. And with myself, I've been kind of out of the game for a while. I've been doing a lot of public policy related stuff. So I saw this as an opportunity to kind of step back into the world of filmmaking and writing. So we actually teamed up with a team which is Second Wind Pictures, led by Joe Wilson. He's a cinematographer, director, and editor here in Pittsburgh. So we teamed up with them, and they were super welcoming. A lot of them already knew each other. They had a group of actors kind of already pulled together. But Stacia, funny enough, ran into Joe and two of his friends who run the production company with him in a cafe in Edgewood. She was actually working. She works as a nanny on the side, and she was like working and just overheard them talking about the 48 and how they wanted to like put a team together. And she just like, as she was leaving, just kind of passed her information off to them.
No kidding.
Yeah,
that's how. And so that's how.
Yeah.
Well, can I just say, hey everybody, I'm so happy with the independent filmmaking scene in Pittsburgh. It's very open and welcoming. It's super easy to get involved. So if anyone's listening to this and has ever wanted to get involved with filmmaking in a minor or major way, check out the 48-Hour Film Project. It's a great way to meet people, a great way to get involved. They have networking events throughout the year. They have a couple different competitions. There's like a lot of ways to get involved with filmmaking in Pittsburgh, and you can do that by checking out the Facebook pages for the Pittsburgh 48-Hour Film Project. There's a few other filmmaking pages in Pittsburgh, but that's a really great way to just post and say, hey, I want to get involved in stuff. What do I do? And you're almost certain to get shepherded into some team that's looking for, at the very least, an extra set of hands, but they'll probably ask you, hey, what can you do? So that's great. And to the community, good on you. Love this stuff. So that's awesome.
Yeah,
I just got right into it. Just overheard a conversation. Hey, I want in.
And that's it.
Wow.
Yeah, so welcoming, so kind. So yeah, back to your question. Joe and a few of his friends, they went to like the start of it and got the genres and everything, and then we met back at Joe's house. Met some of the other actors and some of the crew that they had pulled together. We also teamed up with a very, very close friend of mine, Sam Trossel. Been a friend of his since high school. He lives in the Pittsburgh area too. He's a great photographer. If anyone needs pictures, reach out to Sam. I'll give you his information. So he joined the team as well, just to kind of step, his toes into filmmaking as well. And, he did some stuff growing up, so he's kind of also coming back to the scene a little bit. But yeah, so we had a excellent pitch session that first night of the 48. I think we met maybe at 7 and left like at midnight. And it was just literally all of us that were able to come in person and a few people on Zoom. And we just pitched ideas to each other and was like, do you want to do this? Do you want to do that? Like, what direction do we want to go in? And for the majority of the time, you were going to do an like apocalyptic sort of story. But then at the last minute, Joe, I think it was Joe, he brought up the real life story of a recent Alabama Supreme Court ruling, which ruled that frozen embryos that were created via IVF can now be considered as human beings or equivalent to human beings. So we kind of all talked about that for a while, and that really piqued my interest because of my public policy background, and because it was film to film, and we were fortunate enough to have a cast and crew of majority women actually, which was amazing.
Works out great for the genre.
Yeah, works out excellent.
One team got Film de Femme, and when they were accepting one of their awards, they said, we're a team of mostly guys. We got Film de Femme, and we had one young lady on the team, and I think they said, but you get everything with her. She's got, like, she did her own makeup and all that stuff. So, but yeah, I was like, oh, that sounded like, I mean, they did well with it. Sounded like it was a bit of a hurdle, so good for them, but very convenient.
Yes.
Good job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here we go.
So we were so fortunate to have that crew and cast together. And then Jackie Mitchell, who's another local actor and director now in Pittsburgh, she directed The Couriers, and we just kind of went with it. So once Joe brought up that idea, we were like, yes, this is a very topical and a very just relevant story that needed to be told. And it was funny because we still kind of kept, like, once you all watch the movie, you'll see this, but we still kind of kept that dark, like, apocalyptic tone to it. It was very kind of Handmaid's Tale almost in the content of the movie. But the ironic part about it, though, because of rulings like this and what that might mean for family planning going forward for people and different activists, is that this is our reality now. Like, the short film kind of takes it in this one direction, but it's very close to kind of the reality we live in a little bit, unfortunately. So we wanted to make a film that could kind of speak to that, how this very dark direction that our nation can go into isn't far off, So we wanted to write a film that spoke to that. We had Jackie. She not only did she direct it, but she starred in it alongside Stacia, my wife, and a few others. And I mean, they killed it out. I'm a little biased, obviously, but they all did great. It was an excellent cast and crew. We had like no problems whatsoever. And finally, getting to the answer of your question, after the pitch session, I wrote the thing on my own, wrote the script on my own. So I went back home, stayed up all night till about 5 a.m, wrote the first draft, sent it to, we have a Discord channel for Second Wind, sent it to everyone in the group. They all provided edits, a lot of different edits, sometimes conflicting edits.
Right, yeah.
As is the nature. And then I sent them, worked on the second draft from about 7 a.m. to 9, and sent it on its way.
Fantastic.
And I went to sleep.
Well, thank you for outlining that for us. So now with that, you've talked about policy making, you've talked a little bit about current political events, all that. One of the historical projects you talked about also deals with some politics and all that. Is sometimes when you're dealing with political subjects in film, even if people agree with, like, let's say you're making a film that has a particular message in it, even sometimes it can turn people off who, even if they agree with your sentiment on it. I think that it's really easy for films to, like, while trying to have a message, to fall into it feeling more like it's propaganda. Not saying that's what happened with you, by the way. I'm just saying this happens. Is that something that you think about as a writer when you're tackling serious topics like this, particularly ones that are politically, I don't want to say necessarily oriented, but where politics is a factor in the narrative?
I've never had anyone ask me that question before, and I appreciate it. I think no. I don't think it's something I think about. And I think for me it's because, I've always been back and forth between the arts and public policy, like I mentioned. And for a long time, I actually wanted to run for office myself. I actually almost did a few years
for
back.
Any particular position?
Yeah, so actually last year I almost ran in the state representative election.
No kidding.
Yeah, I live in Lawrenceville, so in that district, but I decided not to do it last minute. But yeah, that's always been something that I thought to be on my horizon. So I think, to your question, I'm always kind of emboldened to talk about the things that are difficult to talk about when it comes to policy. And I think part of the job for film and theater and all other art forms is to start a conversation, and that doesn't have to be its purpose. But I think that just kind of happens naturally. As humans, we like to discuss the things we hate and discuss the things we love, So for my process and the work that I do, I think it's an added bonus if it sparks a conversation about something, So if couriers can start a conversation about that aspect of public policy, great, perfect. Let's do it. Let's have that conversation. Let's expand on the project, and hopefully it can lead to something positive. But I think because of my work in public policy and how I always saw it, I don't shy away from doing that stuff. So
that's cool that you have a how would you say it? It's good when your films say something. It's like there's some and sometimes everyone approaches their films their own way, right?
Yes,
and something that I try to think about when I'm making something is this entertaining? Is part of it.
That's important too.
Yeah,
That's
it's
important.
well, sometimes though I've definitely I know I've done this at least on one project. I don't know that I'd say I ever had this as a phase, but there sometimes you can be making a film and be so intent on, hey, this is my vision and I'm making this for me and all that, and you might forget the audience sometimes. Like you might forget, like, hey, do people want to watch this? It's like,
no, that's hard.
And it's like that balance. It's like, oh, this is my voice, but actually I'm also doing this song and dance for the people that I might not have even met them, and there's that, but there's also, does your film say something? It doesn't, and that can mean any number of things. It could be political. It could be, about just relationships or like anything. But it's like, all right, what's this really about? And it's something that I think when your film has something to say, that's where it's harder for people to be indifferent to it. There's definitely such thing. I don't know. I was gonna say there's definitely such thing as a film that misfires, but even that, I'm not totally sure what I would mean by that. But this is cool that like you think about these things, politics or policy is a big part of your life.
Yeah,
it's your work. Is there a type of I guess I'd say a lot of the time stories are about us emotionally connecting with people. Sometimes it's, they can be pretty informational, right? But when connecting with stories on an emotional level and you're talking about how policy can, like one thing can affect people's lives and all that, is it's really easy. And like a lot of the time people are supposed to approach stories from an emotional way. Is that also a way that you approach, I guess, the way that you view policy? Like, is the human factor always there for you? Is that how that works?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think you're about to get me on my political soapbox here.
Go for it, man. Say what. I don't want you to pretend to be someone else just for me.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
No, I think, the human experience in our stories have to be a part of that policy and political process because it affects our day-to-day life. That's just what it is. So any person out there that's doing it, doing policy work for the money or for the power or for the influence solely, I think is doing a disservice to our communities. So whether it be in writing, whether it be in policy work, talking about us as people in our communities and how we connect with one another and also how we differ from one another is critical because you need to understand that to better inform the work you want to do. Full stop.
Very cool. So, it sounds like, and if you don't want to talk about this, you don't have to. But it sounds like you may be a bit of an activist as well. Is that something that you bring activism into your writing as well, or do you keep those separate? Is this terminology that goes through your head when you're writing?
It is. I mean, I haven't. Unfortunately, it's not something I've done a lot of yet, which is, like you said, mixing that advocacy with writing. Right. It is something I want to do, though.
Okay.
And I think as I'm kind of having this rebirth of my creative self right now, that's what I'm trying to figure out. And I think it's been difficult too, if I could be honest, because it also kind of begs the question of what I want to do kind of as my career. Like I've been in transportation policy for probably 3 to 4 years now, like solely just transportation policy, and doing other stuff on the sides. I've been on community boards. I've worked on nonprofit boards, volunteered on different campaigns before. And as I've been doing all that stuff, writing has always been kind of in the background. And, I've always kind of stepped my toe back into it and kind of jumped out, and thought, oh, this isn't the time for me to do it. I'm focusing on all this other stuff. But right now, and honestly, because of the 48, I'm trying to figure out how to better blend the two things that I love. And like, how can I make the combination of those two things my career? And so it doesn't have to be a choice of me jumping into one and jumping into the other. And the only reason why I say that, because people can do multiple things in their life, and if they can, they should. I think it's hard for me because, one, discipline is a little bit of an issue for me, and motivation, but also policy and politics, and then creative writing are both very, very draining, soul-sucking, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but soul-sucking things.
Soul-sucking in the positive sense?
Like in the sense of like you had to put your all into it.
Yes.
Into both to really make an impact. And that's what I want to do. So what I'm trying to figure out now is how I can blend the two, because I want to put my whole self into it and all my time into it. But it's so hard to keep bouncing back and forth.
It's easy to experience burnout.
Absolutely.
In that case, is there a way that you rejuvenate yourself?
Honestly, hanging out with friends, and being around people. Yeah, I have a huge friend group, which I'm very, very fortunate to have. The quote unquote core friend group. We've all been friends since high school. So I've known them, since 2010. And we've all been very close since then. And we've expanded our friend group since then. And most of us live in Pittsburgh now. So just hanging out with them on the weekends or just during the week. We play board games a lot. We actually, just this past weekend, we're so nerdy of us, but we created our own friend group, Survivor, like the TV show Survivor.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. So my friend Sam, who I mentioned earlier, he played the host, and curated an entire weekend of just games and eliminations. And we just did that this whole weekend.
That's awesome.
And it was great. It was great. And just having moments like that really rejuvenate me. And I think all of us in the group in what we do in our professional lives and personal lives. And that really kind of gives me the energy to
Nice. Do you ever do, you mentioned board games. Do you ever do strategy war games?
Oh, we love those.
Yeah?
Like Diplomacy, Risk.
Right.
Yeah, Twilight Imperium, if people know that one.
Right. Do you ever play Axis and Allies?
Love Axis and Allies.
Hell yeah.
Love you.
So,
if you ever want to play, let me know.
I do always want to play Axis and Allies.
Let me know. I
always want to play Axis and Allies. It's I've only really played this one version because they have different editions. They have Axis and Allies in Europe, Axis and Allies in Pacific, and all that. My favorite one is the world map one, and it's I have my dad's set of Axis and Allies, which I've borrowed. And it's my favorite one. The balance on this particular version of it, I'm not sure what's like in the other ones. I like the scope of it's a world war. I want to play the whole war. I want to do the whole thing. But way that game is designed is so genius and beyond my understanding of how they were able to make it so that the way that it is and the way the rules are and all that, a lot of the time the game will just play out the way that the war did.
Yeah, absolutely.
and not even necessarily the good guys win all the time, but like sometimes the Axis get the upper hand in it. But just, anytime I play as the Soviets in it, I just end up just get as many infantry as possible and just throw them at the Germans, and like that, or just a lot of the ways that like where you end up attacking, the way that map is made with all the other mechanics in the game is brilliant because it compels you to go for the same place as
every
the
time.
real life thing. Really fantastic. So, but I love Axis and Allies. And it's funny because a lot of my favorite types of board games, I think to most people on the outside when I'm playing them, it doesn't necessarily look like I'm having a ton of fun. Like, I'll laugh and like, get into it. But I'm like, it's just very tedious, slow, like, okay, I'm counting the numbers over here. The stuff that normally I don't want as a part of my life. But when it's a game that involves killing the Nazis, then I'm just...
You're locked in.
That risk takes me forever to play. Yeah. Like, because I've added a couple house rules sometimes.
You got to.
And it's like these summit meetings that happen.
You have to do it.
It's great. Yeah. In college, we had this one game of Risk that went for like over a week. It was, and like we like wearing like camo and just like
you have to role play with it.
Yeah, be like, we will set up a border agreement between Kursk, and here and like have dice as counters to be like, all right, we're not going to break this treaty in this place for
this amount
turns, all that.
Yes.
We ended up putting in rules for earthquakes, plagues, and rebellions as well. If we got to a stagnation point between it, it's like, all right, we got to shake this up, roll the dice. Is there a rebellion? Okay, who's it against? All right, which territory is it in? How many? And then it's just a third player that's like, all right, and we roll the dice to see what direction they attack in.
I love that.
And so it's just the game starts playing against a friend of mine and I came up with that because we got normally Risk, because it builds momentum. Yeah. Usually one side just ends up winning. But for some reason, we got into this basically a stalemate in Risk, which is, in my experience, almost impossible. But then we're like, all right, well, let's just
what can we do?
Get all these blue wooden squares and put them in. Anyway, so love that stuff.
Beautiful. Perfect. Yeah, if I can ever get into like game making, that would be ideal. I won at that point.
Yeah.
Like if I could make something like Axis and Allies and like balance it and like have that storytelling aspect of it, that would be
fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, you've got the film that you're working on with Curtis going on. We've got the Courier in the description. If y'all, depending on when you watch this, it might be in there when we first release it. So just take a look, everybody. And your film also was nominated.
It was. Yeah. It was nominated for Best Film, which was amazing to be nominated for that. We had two. I may forget some, so apologies. But we had two nominations for Supporting Actor. Were nominated for Best Director, and then a few other technical nominations as well. I can't remember what those were, but yeah, and it was in. I was talking to Joe from Second Wind Pictures about it, and they've done the 48 a few times before, but this is the first time them and their crew have all been nominated as well. So it was a great opportunity to just kind of be at the award show and meet people. We didn't win anything, unfortunately.
Wow.
But and Jackie, actually, our director and lead, she sent a message to us this morning because she went to like the after party get together, and she just mentioned to us how so many people walked up to her and was like, we loved your film. It told a great story. Like, thank you for making something like this. So just knowing that it connected with some people I mean, not to sound cheesy, but that's the win for me, that it connected with the audience. So.
Wonderful. Well, I think on that very positive note, we'll wrap up here. Kris, thank you so much for joining me. I've enjoyed this conversation immensely.
Likewise.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me.
I'd love to have you on again sometime.
Please,
Great.
anytime.
Wonderful.
You have my number.
Yeah, at the very least, when you've got another film, come on by, talk about it. Love to see it.
Yeah.
So
hopefully I will have many more.
Wonderful. Excellent. All right, everybody, thank you for spending your time with us, because no refunds. You can't have it back. But we thank you very much for giving us the time that you have for this. Don't forget, subscribe, check out the description. If there's any links down there, we'll have the courier. And then if there's some social media that Kris would like you to follow him on, I'll have that there. Please do so. And we just look forward to you joining us again. Don't forget about the meetup. Book your own space at StudioME.me. And if you're watching this at a later date than when we posted it, well, we hope we've helped you feel like it's Friday, unless you work on the weekend. So, bye-bye. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you want to start your own podcast, why wait? Reach out to us at StudioME.me, and I hope you hear me again soon.